welcome to the AT&T CyberThreat Report for February 16, 2012. I'm Nancy Grover, and joining me today we have Jim Clausing, and Jim is our lead malware analyst. Hi, Jim. What are you going to talk about today?
Thanks, Nancy. I have two things I want to talk about today. First is a story that was in the New York Times nearly a month ago, actually, about wide open cameras, video cameras on the internet. And it just got me thinking about, we occasionally talk about the security of other devices other than, the computers and the mobile devices. And so this got me thinking about those again, so I figured it was a good time to talk about that. And then this week was Microsoft Patch Tuesday, so I want to talk a little bit about the patches from this month.
Okay. And then we also have Dave Gross, and Dave's the Senior Incident Response Analyst. And Dave, what are you going to talk about today?
Thanks, Nancy. Today I'm going to talk about a breach that happened years ago at Nortel, and it went on for quite a long time, so we'll discuss what happened there.
Yeah, I'm interested to hear about that because I understand it was a very long time.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm also going to talk about a recent infrastructure security report from Arbor Networks that talks about how some of the DDoS attacks are now spreading to the IPv6 network. So I think that's pretty significant. I also want to talk, or actually kind of discuss tiny URLs with the two of you, too. So before we get going with the show, I just want to remind you all that if you have any questions or feedback or anything about what you hear about on the show, or you just want to pass along some good information to us, you can contact us at cyberthreat@list.att.com. So first up, we have Jim, Dave, who's going to tell us a little bit more about that Nortel attack.
Sure. Thank you, Nancy. What happened, evidently, the computers at Nortel were breached sometime, they think, back around 2000. And I guess they were breached by stealing the login credentials for several Nortel executives. I think they said 7 of them altogether, including one who was a former chief executive. And the breach went on for nearly 10 years. So it started way back when in 2000 and went to like 2010. And they didn't discover it until 2004. And the way they had discovered it was that an employee noticed that a senior executive downloaded an unusual set of documents. Normally, I guess these were ones that the executive wouldn't normally have a reason to get and download. And so they checked with the executive, and the executive said that they did not download that. And so the investigation continued and found that they were actually being traced to a system that was relaying them to some China-based IP addresses. So it's not clear that these were Chinese hackers here, but that's what's suspected in this case at this point.
So do you know if, like, the document that they finally determined was not downloaded by that officer, were those internal documents?
Yeah, what they were saying is that the documents that were taken were technical papers, research and development reports, business plans, employee emails, and other documents in general. So it could have been, pretty much anything that the executive's account had access to.
Right, so like an espionage almost type thing, or maybe you've got like another company, that a competitor. That sort of thing almost sounds like something, like it could be that rather than, say, a young hacker guy.
Right. Well, we don't really know. We don't know who was on the other end and, what the purpose was. and basically, what they were saying is that the network structure made it easy for the attackers because, they kind of had the hard shell, and once the perimeter was breached, it was easy to move around. There weren't a lot of controls inside, and, we always recommend defense in depth, meaning, just because you've passed one security hurdle, if you have to get to other data, especially if it's more sensitive, you need to pass some other hurdles. So it sounds like there wasn't a lot of that here, and so it made it easier for the attackers to go through.
Yeah, what did we used to call that years ago? It was like, what was it, the hard, crunchy outside and the soft, gooey inside?
Yes, yeah.
We got a little smarter and started not having such a gooey inside.
Yep. So that's what they had here. And one of the other things that was interesting is during the investigation, it seems that Nortel didn't try to determine whether the attackers had compromised any of the products. They were just looking at it as an information leakage kind of event, and most of what they were doing was to combat it was resetting the passwords because they didn't really know what else was going on. It turns out later that they found out that they had a sophisticated software and a rootkit installed on some of the machines that wasn't being detected by the antivirus and stuff that was running on the computers at the time.
You just answered my next question, which was going to be about a password reset.
Yeah, so they were doing that, but the problem is because the attackers had access to the machine at that point, they were able to control whatever went on the machine and get the new passwords by, doing keyboard sniffers and stuff like that. So the password changes at that point didn't really make a difference.
Right, yeah. Wow.
So, now, Nortel is no longer a company. The, pieces have been sold off and stuff, but there may be some residual effects because we don't know whether any of the products were compromised, if some of the documents allowed them to reverse engineer the products and if they found weaknesses and, if they're using them or if there were ways that they actually put backdoors into them or something like that. So,
yeah, I wonder if they are able to. How much of a record they have of what exactly had been breached, read, forwarded, whatever, so if they could identify those products that they really need to take a second look at.
Yeah, it's not clear how good of a record they had on that, and based on what was going on, they said that they first discovered it in 2004, but it had already been going on for 4 years before they had found it.
On for another 6 after that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yep, and so this, at the time it wasn't called APT. That phrase hadn't been coined yet, but this is clearly an APT kind of activity.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Persistent.
Yeah, very persistent.
Wow. Well, that is kind of scary, and I just hope that sets alarms out to a lot of others that could maybe do a second look at their networks and looking for rootkits and that sort of thing.
Well, and it brings up another point that we've made on this show a number of times. Once the box is compromised, once somebody's broken in, don't know what all else they've done, and the fact that they tried to just change passwords and think that was going to solve the problem, that's clearly not enough. That's why, as painful as it is to do, I generally recommend that once the box has been compromised for any length of time, you need to rebuild it because you don't know what else might have been done that you may not be able to detect.
And that's a really interesting point, because if this went on for, say, 10 years, did these people not ever, like, swap out their computers in all of this amount of time? I mean, I know we're speculating here, and we're just talking about it because we don't know exactly what the circumstances were. So you got to wonder, was it the email server that was compromised with the rootkit, or was it, say, a laptop or a desktop computer? And so, we know that once the machine is compromised, that's pretty much bad news. But you would think that if it was a laptop or a desktop, that would have been replaced a number of times in 10 years.
Yeah, but if they've also got the passwords, they can, from the previous one, they can also...
Yes, you're right, just reinstall again.
Right, and depending on how their hooks are in there, if you're restoring the backup, restoring the backup may put their hooks back in, too.
Yeah, and that's always a problem, even when you're rebuilding, is, how far back are you going with your backups to restore your vital data, and always a tricky proposition.
Well, do we have a lesson for everybody from this at all? I think it's pretty obvious.
Yeah, you need to take those breaches very seriously, and
and try to look at other areas. If you find it in one place, see if it spreads somewhere.
Definitely. Well, thanks, Dave. That was really, really good, interesting, and kind of scary, actually. So, Jim, you had something you want to talk about cameras, webcams.
Yeah, this was a story that was in the New York Times, on the New York Times website, in late January, and it was the article was that folks from one of the pen testing companies out there, excuse me, had done some searching, some scanning, and some Google searching, and found a number of video cameras that were remotely accessible from the internet. And we've seen these; they've been out there for a long time. Key issue with these ones in particular that these guys detected this time was that it was some very popular video conferencing machines that were used by executives to for video conferencing with other executives at other companies. And in fact, in the article they talked about some of these were in boardrooms, and they were able to access the cameras, manipulate the cameras, pan around the room, listen in to conversations in the room. And most of the ones they concentrated on were from a particular manufacturer that I'm not going to name because that really isn't the point. But the point is, these kinds of cameras and this kind of technology, there's occasionally a temptation to make it accessible from the internet, to make it easy for colleagues and other in this case other companies to be able to video conference, and you really need to take these seriously and secure them as well, because as the article pointed out, in these cases, wide open. There was no password protecting them. As long as you could find the IP address and you knew, the port to connect to, you could connect in. You could, turn on the camera. You could pan the camera around. You could listen in on conversation, and this kind of video conferencing technology is used a lot these days in boardrooms and law offices, and so you can have some pretty sensitive conversations that the bad guys could listen into if you don't think about securing types of devices.
So I'm, when you first brought up the story, I'm immediately thinking of, say, a camera that's built into a laptop, which I know potentially has some issues as well. So I'm thinking now in terms of the conference room and this conferencing setup. So evidently, no one's going to think it's odd that the camera is suddenly moving around, because evidently people in other conference rooms that are networked together have the ability to move this camera around. So that wouldn't set any kind of bells off, right? Because the camera's moving suddenly.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, some of these are behind a little bubble, and you don't necessarily see that they're panning around, or they're using a digital, like camera that I've got here that I'm using for this recording. I can pan it around to some extent just via software. There's nothing that physically moves.
That's true.
Fortunately, there's nothing to see behind me. So, and the guys in this story, they were talking about, in some of these cases, they were able to pan, look out the window, see squirrels on the ground outside, or zoom in on the wall and see paint flakes and that kind of stuff.
Do we know if anyone's even been compromised by this, or is this just sort of an experiment that these guys...
This was an experiment. These guys are a pen test company. They did do the scan and Google searches across a fair chunk of address space. But one of the things that they noted was even if you can't directly get to some target, they found a case where they were able to connect into an open camera at a law firm, that then they were able to access their menu of other connections, and they could see that they would have been able to, from there, hop to a financial firm, big banking firm, and that's it's kind of scary if.
Right. It sounds almost like the experiment reminds me of a number of years ago, the big experiment done and presented, I think at Black Hat also, but definitely at DEF CON, on war driving. The initial, nobody really thought about that until these guys presented their findings. So it almost sounds like that sort of thing. What are people going to do to protect themselves from this?
Well, there are ways of locking these cameras down better. The problem is that it actually takes some effort. They mostly ship pretty much wide open, and so if you don't think about it when you're installing these things, you can get into trouble. But there are ways to secure them, tighten them down, keep them behind firewalls, and open up particular business partner VPN type connections to protect the streams and that kind of thing. But it's another one of these devices that you don't really always necessarily think about the fact that there's a whole computer there. We've talked about this in the past about things like printers, and even some of these newer the newest printer, scanner, copier machines that are network connected. You can access them from the network, and they keep on there. They've got hard disks on there. They may have copies of documents scanned or printed. It's not just laptops, the desktops, or even the phones. It's that everything that we seem to want to connect to the internet these days, we need to think about protecting those devices as well.
Right, and you're saying about these cameras being used for video conferences, but it could be that there's just a meeting going on in that room that's a local meeting, not having anything to do with a video conference, but if somebody can get in, they can eavesdrop on that meeting that everybody thinks is private because they're holding it in this room.
The equipment is there. It's left powered on most of the time, And so if it's accessible, then that's the point that these guys were trying to make when the story hit the New York Times website last month. Is you need to think about these things. Mm-hmm. Everything that you connect to the internet, think about how to secure that. Don't want anybody to be able to scan, find it, access it.
And I remember that a couple months ago when Josh Lackey joined us, one of our other analysts, and said he had a refrigerator that had a USB port in it, which he thought was cool at the time. So imagine that you have a picture, you stick it in there so you can display your picture, I guess, on your refrigerator. You may have all kinds of other things on that USB that you're not even thinking about, that now that your refrigerator is networked, people can get a hold of.
Yeah, and the USB thing could take us off in a completely other tangent. Yeah, how you infect your.
So you remember some time ago when webcams started showing up all the time, and maybe they didn't automatically go on and off, and people were advised to put a piece of electrical tape over the camera lens, so that they didn't accidentally go off, or someone didn't set them off from remotely. So do you think people could do that in these conference rooms? Maybe not a piece of electric tape, but something to cover the camera. Obviously, that doesn't take care of the sound issue, but...
and they do make covers for the lenses for some of these cameras, but, you either need to lock it down, very tightly in... You're only allowing connections from very specific locations. Mm-hmm. Frankly, you need to disconnect it. You need to turn it off.
Right, definitely. And that's a good place to end this story. And thanks a lot, Jim. That was another scary but interesting tidbit there. So today, I was looking through the news, as I always do, about security issues and technology and things like that. And I saw this ruling that the EU did concerning social media providers, say like a Facebook or a Twitter or Google Plus or any of those. And it was concerning privacy issues, and I'm not even going to go into the whole privacy thing for the show, but it made me think about other issues, security issues within these social networks. But before I move on to that, I just love this term that one of the things the EU had ruled on was a user's right to be forgotten, and I thought that was great. And that's where, if I belong to one of these social networks, I delete a picture, I delete a post, doesn't necessarily mean that thing is gone forever. It's still there somewhere. And so the EU is determined that when I want something deleted, it should be deleted. I shouldn't be held accountable in my 30s because I posted a picture when I was 18 and doing really horrible things, and now my potential employer sees this and I don't get the job. So I just love that phrase, right to be forgotten. But again, it made me think about security on these sites, and that made me think about tiny URLs or bid URLs or whatever you want to call them, and that's where you use a service to take a URL that might be kind of long and complicated, and you make it quite small so that you can use it in Twitter or something. So basically you take a URL and you've given it a new name, and it directs you to the original URL. We keep warning people, originally in their email and now on these social media sites, not to be clicking on crazy links, right? Because you could potentially be phished. You could potentially get some malware installed on your computer and all of that stuff. But now we've got this issue of these tiny URLs that I could create a tiny URL that goes to a YouTube video, but that's not evident when I look at the final product. So I don't know. I mean, I can't give anyone any kind of tips like how to protect yourself from something like this at this time. But I guess I'm just throwing it out there for discussion. What do you all think? I mean, what can we tell people to watch out for if they're confronted by these strange-looking little URLs that are masking what the real URL is.
And that has been a huge problem recently. I mean, the URL shorteners became very popular because of things like Twitter that have a limit of 140 characters. So, I've seen URLs that were longer than that. And so, they had to shorten them down, fit them into the character limit. But the problem then is you don't know where you're really. If you're using a web browser, sometimes you can get like a Firefox extension or something that when you hover the mouse over it, it'll expand it and you can see where it's going. But, you're not necessarily going to see that in the Facebook app on your smartphone. So, it's a problem. And I'm not sure yet what the solution is because don't necessarily know where you're going.
That's helpful to know, just that there's a Firefox add-on. I had no idea that even existed. So I'll definitely be checking that out.
Yeah, but these URL shorteners, you really have to be careful with when you come across these things. Look at the context and be suspicious. I would say raise your suspicion anytime you see any of these in use. There have been cases where there's been phishing attacks that get through a lot of the filters because they're using these shorteners. And so there's, because it's a shortened URL, it's a legitimate service, and there's no way to tell where that thing goes until you go visit the site. And so they can't make a determination whether it's malicious or not. And some of these sites, when you go to it, just the fact of browsing to it causes your system to become infected because it's a drive-by type of exploit where when you get to the site, it tries all kinds of browser exploits and things like that to try to compromise your machine. So, these shortened URLs can be very dangerous because, just by clicking on them, you can get yourself infected.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wish we had better answers. I just wanted to bring it up because I do think it's an issue, and, I hope that we as a security community could come up with some sort of solution to this problem soon.
Yeah, it's something I think we need to be looking at, trying to figure out a better solution, because right now we don't have a good one.
Right.
Yeah, I think, ultimately there will be something where you can have a proxy go visit these sites for you to, find out where it resolves to before you actually go there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that would probably be the best solution. Well, I'm sorry to bring something up like that I can't give you a good answer to. But again, I just thought it was worth mentioning and worth thinking about. And so, Jim, you're going to tell us all about Patch Tuesday.
Yeah, this is the second Tuesday of the month was earlier this week, and so that's when Microsoft does their usual patches. And it's a lot of the same things we've said every time. One of the big reasons I wanted to mention the patches this time, though, was that almost all of them were rated as critical by Microsoft this time. So this nice little graphic, courtesy of Microsoft, you can see nearly all of the patches that they gave out this week had an exploitability index that was high, and the severity of several of them was critical. It actually ended up being a total of 9 of the 14 CVEs that were rated as critical. So, in particular, the Microsoft's recommendations is the two that are, they recommend you patch most quickly were MS-12-010 and -0, I think it was. Again, we've got these two were potential remote code execution vulnerabilities, which means that somebody out on the internet could cause code to be executed on your machine. One of these we had talked about before, related to the city one that we talked about last month. It was a similar one where you could have some sort of a media file embedded in a web page that would cause the compromise of your system. The other one, the C runtime one there, is related to issues that they've been patching going back to the middle of 2010, where they had an issue of DLLs running, in the current directory versus the default locations. So basically, as always, make sure that you patch as soon as practical. And a couple of these could be remotely exploited. At least one case, I think there was proof of concept code. I'm not sure that any of them were being exploited in the wild that we're aware of, but there's proof of concept code out there that could at least cause program crashes, if not the actual remote code exploit yet. So anyway, it's that time of the month. It's time to be diligent about testing and patching your systems.
Well, you did answer my one question that I had, and that was whether these exploits had been seen in the wild. So it doesn't look like too horrible of a list here, as I've seen before.
It was, though, more critical patches than we've seen. More of them were rated critical than we've seen recently. So, as I said, it's that time of the month.
And Valentine's Day, no less, that we got that.
Oh, yeah. That was our Valentine's gift from Microsoft.
Hey.
Are these for XP and Windows 7, or are they mostly XP or a mixture?
Are they even supporting XP anymore with patches and things?
There are still some security patches, I believe, coming for XP, but that's going to end. Even that's going to end soon if you don't have.
I thought it might have already ended, but okay, so they still do have some.
And there are still a lot of XP machines out there, so. But most of these apply to the more current OSs: Vista, Windows 7, Server 2003, R2, 2008. So.
And I just got a little message from our producer that XP will be supported until, in this manner anyway, till April of 2014.
I thought it was ending sooner than that, but okay.
Yeah, I did too. I know they keep pushing that deadline out. So maybe they did. So, okay, well, good. Thank you very much, Jim. And, today we don't have the malware report or the internet weather report, so I'm going to end with a little, a report that I read. There's a whole bunch of reports coming out right now on the, kind of the state of the network from last year and what we're going to expect for this coming year and all of that. And one that caught my eye is something from Arbor Networks, and they were looking at the kind of the state of infrastructure security. So I put up some bullet items here. kind of their biggest observations. And this report covers from October 2010 to November 2011. So it's pretty recent stuff. They found that and I thought this was a pretty significant number here, that 25% of network administrators observed, and security people too, observed that DDoS attacks had exceeded the total bandwidth of their data center. I thought that was, again, very significant, that if 25% were seeing this, and essentially bringing their data center to its knees from an attack, that's pretty bad stuff. 50% reported application layer attacks on their networks, and 13% reported attacks that were greater than 10 gigabits per second. And the report also pointed out that that's kind of the new normal now, to have these huge flood-based attacks that are using 10 gigs and more per second. So I can see how that could definitely be taking a data center down like that, or servers. But the most significant thing that I noticed in the report was this whole IPv6 DDoS attacks, because that's not something that I think anyone's really talked about or that anyone has noticed before. And the number is pretty small. As you can see, it's only 4% have experienced that sort of thing. But we have to keep in mind that even though we were all supposed to go to IPv6 some time ago, and there was a definite cutoff, a lot of people are not using it yet, have not yet migrated to it. So again, I just found that to be pretty significant. And I don't know, what do you guys think? Do you think that this is something that we're going to keep seeing more and more of as we start migrating more and more to IPv6? And I say we as a collective whole, not just the three of us sitting here.
Absolutely. It's because so little of the total internet traffic at the moment is IPv6. I'm not surprised that this number, is so small at the moment. But all of the attacks that we've seen on IPv4, as soon as IPv6 network becomes large enough that the bad guys think they can make money there, we're going to see all of these same attacks migrating over there. And we've seen malware. I gave a talk last summer where I mentioned this, but we've seen malware that used IPv6 for command and control back as early as 2004.
Oh, wow.
Even though there was hardly anybody using it back then, the malware has been capable of using it for a long time. And as more and more systems are being installed with IPv6 enabled out of the box, and as connectivity gets better, I mean, that's one of the big issues that we've had with IPv6 up to this point is there are parts of the internet that, depending on which carrier you've got, may not be reachable via IPv6, and that's all going to smooth out in the coming years. And as soon as that critical mass that a fair chunk of the traffic is going over IPv6, we're going to see these attacks going over IPv6. And there are 2 points that I really want to make about that. First is we've got to be able to monitor our IPv6 networks as well as we have monitored our IPv4 networks. So we've got to make sure that we're upgrading our monitoring capabilities, our defensive capabilities, our firewalls, and all of that. And then the other thing, going back to those bullets on your previous slide, if the attack traffic is overwhelming the bandwidth of your data center, you can't defend that yourself. Mm-hmm. You need to establish relationships with your, with your ISPs, with your upstreams, because those kinds of attacks have to be cut off before they reach your perimeter, or you're already dead in the water. And we've talked before about the the AT&T DDoS defense types of things, you've got to involve your upstream ISPs to defend against those particular attacks.
And going on with what you were talking about just a second before there, the immaturity of the IPv6 network is I'm thinking that's why it seems that people are not able to scrutinize the network traffic to really distinguish a DDoS attack. I don't know why that is. I don't know if it's just, again, it's immaturity, the tools are lacking, or what. But, when you look at this pie chart and you see that 21% aren't even sure if they had an attack on their IPv6 network, that seems like a pretty big number to me.
Well, part of that could be that so little of their business is done over IPv6 because the customers aren't on IPv6, so they may have had a denial of service against that they didn't really notice because it was a pipe that they don't business on. But exactly, if our tools aren't ready for detecting it, for defending against it, then we're still we're a sitting duck.
Right, and as you were saying, Jim, there's nothing in IPv6 that would prevent these kind of attacks. It's the same basically as IPv4, and it's just kind of a critical mass there in terms of the amount of targets that are using IPv6 versus IPv4, and the number of machines that an attacker could get control over to be able to mount the attack, because that's an issue too. If you have a victim that you want to attack on IPv6, but you don't have very many attackers, you're not going to mount very much of an attack.
And the other thing is, how much damage are you doing to them? If their IPv6 servers aren't, if the victim's IPv6 servers aren't in the same locations as their IPv4 servers, may be able to DOS the IPv6 site, and the company hardly notices. They're still able to do business from their IPv4. So.
And one more item that I did not show here in the bullet points or anything, but I think it's worth mentioning in this whole report, and particularly these DDoS attacks, is that probably the same percentage or close to it of the attacks are now hacktivism rather than just malicious attacks. So I think it was 30. I'm sorry, I didn't make note of it. It was I'm going to guess in the 30% anyway of the attacks were malicious, and another 30-something% were hacktivism. And I thought that was pretty interesting too. Now, hacktivism, it's been around for ages. I think the first instances, and maybe not the actual first instance, but early instances were the whole Free Kevin thing, when in an effort to get people to notice that Kevin Mitnick was in jail, some of the young hacker guys were hacking web pages and splashing Free Kevin across them. And then, we've seen instances of it, but it seems to be a really growing type of attack now suddenly. I saw lots and lots of examples, all kinds of issues that people want to bring other people's attention to. So, again, I don't know if that's something that we're going to continue to see grow, this hacktivism, as opposed to the malicious stuff, or I don't know. Are you guys noticing any extra hacktivism going on?
We'll probably see quite a bit of that going forward, and it's too bad Brian's not here today, because that's
right. He'd be the perfect guy to give us that answer. So. All righty. Well, I think we had a good show, and thanks you guys for being here. And I want to remind everybody that if you have any feedback or questions or anything for us here at the CyberThreat Report, you can contact us at cyberthreat@list.com. www.att.com. And remember that the program's also available at the AT&T Tech channel, which you can get to off the internet, as well as an audio podcast on Twitter, or from iTunes, I'm sorry. You can see us on YouTube and all kinds of probably other places. But thanks, Jim, and thanks, Dave, and we'll see you all next time.